Vladimir Putin just rejected the ceasefire offer that Trump had presented to Ukraine and Russia, and now Russians are speaking up against their own government. They want this war to end. They want the Russian economy to get back to serving Russian people and not the Russian military. On top of this, we also have Trump coming out with a statement saying that if Russia goes forward with rejecting the ceasefire, then there will be consequences that Russia cannot even imagine. So let's talk about all this, starting with why Putin is not happy with this ceasefire deal. Today, Putin held a press conference with the Belarusian dictator Lukashenko, and he started off with a statement saying that the ceasefire is not a US proposal. In fact, it's a Ukrainian proposal that Ukraine begged the US to implement. And that's exactly why he has to be careful accepting something that Ukraine wants.
The cessation should lead to peace and eliminate the root cause of the crisis. Now, regarding Ukraine's readiness to cease hostilities, you know about the US-Ukraine meeting in Saudi Arabia. Perhaps outwardly, it looks like a decision made by the Ukrainian side under American pressure. In fact, I am sure that the Ukrainian side must have asked the Americans for this. Given the situation that is currently happening on the planet.
So, now let's look at everything that has happened over the past few weeks objectively. First, Trump calls Zelensky a dictator. Then they agreed on a minerals deal. Then there was the whole falling out we saw on national TV in the White House in the Oval Office. Then Trump decided to pause the aid and pause the intelligence sharing, specifically pointing out that he does not believe Ukraine is ready for peace, and that's exactly why US aid is being paused. Now, I don't know how you can look at all this then come to a conclusion that it was Ukraine who was asking the US for a favor in terms of a ceasefire, and in fact, US granted it. That's just not true. We know even from the statements Trump made that it was his goal even before he took the office that he wants this war to end, even if that meant that Ukraine would lose some territory. Before moving forward, if you guys can please hit that subscribe button down below to keep up with all the geopolitical news like this one. Let's begin. So yeah, I think it's moronic to say that this was not a US proposal, but rather a Ukrainian request. Now, I think we all know what this is. Putin himself does not believe what he's saying. This is just one of those Russian KGB tactics, where they want to say no to the ceasefire, but they don't want to piss off Trump. So they're making up excuses about the deal without directly saying that, hey, we just don't want the ceasefire. Now, after his opening statement, Putin goes on to add a bunch of conditions to the ceasefire proposal that Trump administration presented him. Basically what he's saying is, hey, I agree with what you're giving me, but if you just change it completely, then I'll agree with it even more.
First of all, I would like to start by thanking US President Trump for his attention to the settlement in Ukraine. We agree with the proposals to cease hostilities, but we proceed from the fact that this cessation should be such that it leads to long-term peace and eliminates the original causes of this crisis. But who will give the orders to cease hostilities? And what will be the price of such orders? Can you imagine almost 2,000 kilometers of front line? Who will determine who and when, across 2,000 kilometers, has violated the ceasefire? And then, who will blame whom for violating this agreement? These are many of the questions that need to be carefully analyzed by both sides. That's why the idea itself is right, and we absolutely support it. But there are questions we should discuss. We should discuss this proposed ceasefire with our U.S. partners. Maybe we should have a call with President Trump and discuss it with him. But we support the idea itself of finishing the conflict in a peaceful way.
Then after this, he goes on to accidentally say what he really wants. He wants the Ukrainian leadership to surrender. He wants Ukraine to surrender. He does not want Ukraine to exist as a sovereign state. He says that he does not want a ceasefire right now because Russian military has Ukrainian soldiers trapped in Kursk. If there's a ceasefire, these soldiers will be able to get away scot-free. This statement is pretty similar to the statement he made at the beginning of the war that Russian military will be in Kyiv in 3 days. That was his special military operation, the 3-day special military operation that's still going on.
И мы за. Но есть нюансы. В чем они заключаются?
We are in favor, but there are nuances. What are they? First, what are we going to do with this section of the wedge in the Kursk region?
Боевые действия на 30 суток. Что это означает? Что все, кто там находится,
If we cease hostilities for 30 days, what does that mean? Will everyone in there leave without a fight? Are we supposed to let them out after they have committed massive crimes against civilians? Or will the Ukrainian leadership give us the command to lay down our arms, to just surrender?
непонятно. А как будут решаться другие вопросы?
How will it be? It is unclear. How will other issues be addressed across the entire line of contact? And that is almost 2,000 kilometers. As you know, Russian troops are advancing in almost all areas of the contact. Conditions are being created for us to blockade entire, fairly large units.
Значит, эти 30 суток будут как использоваться? Для того, чтобы
So, what will these 30 days be used for?
продолжилось
Will Ukraine continue this forced mobilization? Will they supply weapons there?
для того, чтобы туда поставлялось оружие, для того, чтобы мобилизованные вновь подразделения
Will newly mobilized units be trained? Or will none of this happen? The question then arises,
Тогда возникает вопрос,
what will it be?
каковы будут,
How will verification controls be handled?
как будут решаться,
How can we ensure that nothing like this will happen?
как мы можем и как нам будет гарантировано, что ничего подобного происходить не будет. Контроль как будет организован?
In reality, Russia has gained minimal ground in the Kursk region, but it's the Ukrainian military that's pulling back. Now, I'm sure many of you guys are wondering, why are Ukrainians pulling back if Russia is not gaining ground? Well, remember when US paused the intelligence sharing with Ukraine? It more specifically paused intelligence sharing relating to any offensive operations. We had Steve Witkoff say publicly that all the defensive intelligence sharing is still being relayed to the Ukrainian counterparts. But US considers the Ukrainian hold on the Kursk territory an offensive operation, so they stopped giving them any information relating to that region. Now, Ukraine had to make a strategic decision. They had to decide, was it worth putting Ukrainian lives at risk to control a territory that they may not be able to use in negotiations? Now, this is where it's important to remember that this was happening before the ceasefire talks that happened in Saudi just a few days ago. This was when the aid and intelligence was still paused, and we did not know if it would restart after the negotiation talks in Saudi. At this point, Ukrainians likely believed that the Trump administration may not help them trade the Kursk territory for Ukrainian territory that Russia controls. So they did not want to risk Ukrainian lives over something that's not useful. That's why they decided to start pulling back, and that's exactly what's happening. Now, Russia is using this situation to say, hey, look, we're making gains, when in reality, they are really not. In fact, this was such a good news for Putin that he actually went to a safe house that was a few miles away from the Kursk region on the front lines, and he did a whole photo shoot in a security guard's uniform. But anyways, that's not the main point. Here we have General Jack Keane breaking this situation down way better than I could.
So Russia says no to the ceasefire offer. They want to recapture the area I just described over there. Where are we now?
Well, first, I do think they'll recapture that area. As you indicated, think of this. No one has occupied Russian territory since Hitler and the Germans in World War II. They've occupied this territory for 6 months. They brought in North Koreans, 10,000 plus strong, to retake that territory, and it took all of this time. That's why if you put up last year's map of that area in red right there, it would look relatively the same. They made some marginal tactical gains, but what they really wanted to do is make operational gains to take them all the way down into Odessa, capture Odessa, and go further into Ukraine to the west than what you see on that map. None of that has been accomplished. Russia has a lot more challenges than their narrative would suggest. Their narrative is we're on the offense, Ukraine's on the defense, therefore they're losing. Not surprised that they push back on the ceasefire. I'm not convinced yet that Russia is serious about making major concessions and willing to compromise to get to a peace agreement. I think that really remains to be seen.
Luckily, Trump held a press conference with none other than NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte right after this Putin conference that ended this morning. And at this press conference, Trump was asked about comments Putin made. This is what he had to say, and it came with a warning for Russia.
Well, we'd like to see a ceasefire from Russia. And we have, not been working in the dark. We've been discussing with Ukraine land and pieces of land that would be kept and lost and all of the other elements of a final agreement. There's a power plant involved, a very big power plant involved. Who's going to get the power plant and who's going to get this and that? And so, it's not an easy process. But phase one is the ceasefire. A lot of the individual subjects have been discussed, though. We've been discussing concepts of land because you don't want to waste time with a ceasefire if it's not going to mean anything. So we're saying, look, this is what you can get. This is what you can't get. They discussed NATO and being in NATO, and everybody knows what the answer to that is. They've known that answer for 40 years, in all fairness. So a lot of the details of a final agreement have actually been discussed. Now we're going to see whether or not Russia's there, and if they're not, it'll be a very disappointing moment for the world.
But he does still have some concerns. He suggested that you two should speak directly. Do you have plans to speak to him soon? If so, when are you confident you can get this across the table?
Sure. He did say that today. It was a very promising statement because other people are saying different things, and you don't know if they have any meaning or I don't know. I think some of them were making statements. I don't think they have anything to do with it. No, he put out a very promising statement, but it wasn't complete. And yeah, I'd love to meet with him or talk to him. But we have to get it over with fast. Every day people are being killed. It's not like, as we sit here...
Hopefully, Trump's actions line up with his warning, because we know when Ukraine didn't seem like they wanted peace, he cut off the aid and he cut off the intelligence sharings. Now, it seems like Russia doesn't really want this ceasefire, so the obvious answer would be to increase the Ukrainian aid, increase the weapons we give them, so they can start putting pressure on the Russian military on the front lines. Then Putin will come to the negotiating table very quickly. Now, Trump did say something interesting in the clip you guys just saw. He said that there were Russian people who were putting out statements about the ceasefire that just didn't make sense, and this is what he meant by that. Here we have a Russian MP, part of the Russian parliament basically, who was saying that Russia will never agree to a ceasefire. Russian MP Viktor Salvoy says Russia will not agree to a 30-day ceasefire because it just enables Ukraine to regroup and rearm. He added that a temporary ceasefire is unacceptable and only plays into Ukraine's hand. And apparently this is a very common thinking among the Russian elites and Russian oligarchs. It's not just the MP who has this kind of thinking. Many Russian war bloggers have said the same thing, and on top of that, Kremlin TV, the propaganda TV that gets their talking points straight from Putin, has been arguing the same point, that Russia is advancing on the front lines. Why would they stop now? But they completely forget to mention that Moscow just experienced the largest attack since this war started, and it was carried out without the US intelligence. This means that Ukraine has more than enough capabilities to keep hurting the Russian economy and the Russian military complex. Here's what Kremlin TV was saying.
People are going to get killed, lots of people.
So we are now smashing their faces, and then we say, now let's have a pause so they can pump you with weapons and intelligence so that in 30 days you can hold us back or something. Well, I can say more. Now, Witkoff, I want to note that they signed it. Do you understand? They finished the press conference and stated that. One thing is clear. They figuratively signed it. Yes. Yes. What they are saying now, and what's important, is that Ukraine forced America to go back to supplying it with weapons and intelligence data, which, judging by the strike on Moscow, it never stopped doing. Therefore, one thing is clear here. Our tasks are set by the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, and we will fulfill them. We are deeply indifferent to what these people have agreed upon. And for those who thought that Trump will come and everything would be fine for us. Number, not fine. But this, by the way, don't lose your minds. In fact, this is already a failure of the peace plan. Russia has only two allies, the Army and the Navy. And our secret trump card is the Strategic Missile Forces. Therefore, we are calmly and systematically solving the tasks set by the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Well, by the way, let me remind you that all this has no meaning at all. This is just the beginning of a long negotiation process.
And of course, we cannot forget about the Russian population. No one is talking about how Russian population is reacting to all this. How are they feeling? They're getting sick of this war, and they're not afraid to voice their concerns. They are wondering, why does Russia even want Crimea? Why does it want Donbass when the Russian citizens in Moscow, in St. Petersburg are struggling? Russian salaries are not keeping up with the rising food prices. Every other day, Russian citizens are watching Ukrainian drones strike Russian refineries, Russian plants, and Russian oil depots. On top of that, the Russian ruble keeps on crashing, and Russian market is all red. Why is Russia still fighting this war? That's the question the Russian population is asking.
I am Russian, and I don't need foreign territories. I don't need Crimea. Crimea is Ukraine. I don't need Donetsk and Luhansk. These territories also are Ukrainian. I don't need Mariupol or other cities occupied by the criminal state. I don't understand why I need to expand my borders if my country is dying out, degrading, and overgrown with hogweed. I have no doubt that my country's soldiers should not be on the territory of Syria, Georgia, Ukraine, or other states. I do not understand why my taxes are not spent on the development of my country, on improving the quality of life of my family, on building houses, roads, on opening schools, kindergartens, and clinics. I did not give my permission for my money to be spent on missiles and shells that hit foreign countries, killing hundreds of thousands of people like me. Why does a manager from the Kremlin have power to match the Tsar? How come the hired man has palaces, castles, apartments, and lives in a different reality? And those under the shitty Russian constitution, which is supposedly the source of power, don't have a damn thing. The population has been dehumanized and performs the function of cattle, not those who decide something in their country. It is possible to shout about the greatness of a superpower and reserves of natural resources, of course. But where are these resources? Do they belong to the people of my sick country? Of course not. Putin's criminal organized crime group has systematically destroyed everything that was called freedoms and had some traces of democracy for a quarter of a century. We have been deprived of the right to choose. And even at the local level, we have been deprived of the opportunity to choose those who represent our interests. Local self-government is a thing of the past, and Kremlin appointees sit in the chair of governors and heads of regions, ready on command to steal and destroy everything that was left to the already poor people. I do not understand how my compatriots explain to themselves the necessity of wars and the need to seize foreign territories. How they have come to conclusions that with arms in hands it is possible to carry love, kindness, and freedom. How can occupation, murder, violence, torture, and other crimes be called the Russian world? In Russia, there is no truth, compassion, love, understanding, and freedoms. There is hatred, aggression, anger, and lack of common sense. The current Russia is a threat to the entire sane world. The majority of the Russian population is a biomass that doesn't care about the politics and wars unleashed by the fucking president of Russia. They do not care that civilians are being killed in Ukraine here and now with their tacit consent. Russians do not understand what it is to hide their loved ones in basements from Russian missile attacks and bury their children near their homes. What it is to go on the roads of death and save their lives and the lives of their children. What it is to start life in a new country where you are not understood. The list could go on forever. None of us chooses our nationality or the country that becomes our homeland. But we have the right to choose the side of the world and help those who suffer from Russian aggression. Help Ukraine. Do what you can. The main thing is to remain human.
Делайте то, что можете. Главное, оставайтесь человеком.
Lastly, as you guys know, over the last 2 weeks, few of our videos have been demonetized by YouTube for talking about sensitive topics and covering violent events. This is why recently we opened up memberships on the channel. This way you guys can directly support our content. Again, you don't have to do it. We'll continue making the videos, but if you enjoy the content and you're able to support us, you can do so by signing up for our membership. It costs less than a cup of coffee at Starbucks and it's greatly appreciated. Russia is on fire, and I mean that literally and figuratively. The oil refineries are burning, the chemical plants are burning, and ammunition depots are burning. On top of that, the Russian media is burning with rage against Trump, who has come out in support of Ukraine and said that if Russia doesn't come to the negotiating table, there's going to be hell to pay. All this anger is boiling up and spreading across the Russian society, and it's only a matter of time before they figure out who they need to be really angry at. The one person who started this all, the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. The Ukrainian strikes inside Russia are getting so devastating and so frequent that there are reports now saying that the Ukraine can shut down the whole Russian energy sector. The one sector that country depends on. The one sector that's saving Vladimir Putin's war economy, or my bad, the special military operation economy. So like always, hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously in the algorithm, and let's get to how Russian people are slowly turning against Putin. Let's start with the Ukrainian strikes inside Russia, more specifically strikes against Russian refineries. As you guys can see from the picture on your screen, these are all the refineries inside Russia, and you can see most of them have been hit by Ukraine one way or another. Just some quick counting, around 20 out of 30 refineries have been hit. So 2/3 of the refineries in Russia are burning, and that's why we see headlines like this. Kyiv Insider reports that Ukraine is now on track to completely destroy Russia's oil industry. Now, in a second, I'll show you guys some clips that are extremely satisfying, but before that, let's quickly go over these articles. In terms of Ukraine's strikes on Russian territory, January was the month that the gloves came off. So you might be asking, why was January the month the gloves came off? Did Ukraine make a New Year's resolution to take down Russia? Well, I'm guessing many Ukrainians probably did, but the main reason the gloves came off during January is because Ukraine now has a self-sustaining, homegrown defense sector that is able to produce missiles and drones that can target deep inside Russia. So they don't need to wait for permission from Western and US allies, US companies, US officials to strike inside Russia. Now they're building the products, they're building the weapons that can strike inside Russia, and they can just strike anytime they want. They don't need anyone's permission. And now, just to prove the point how effective this Ukrainian defense sector has become, let's go over all the strikes that happened in January. Now you can pause on your screen and read all the details, but I want to just quickly read the date to show you guys the frequency. We had a strike on January 4th, then 4 days later on January 8th, then 2 days later January 10th, 11th, 14th, 15th, 16th. It just goes on. Almost every other day we have a strike inside Russia, and they're hitting high value targets. These aren't similar to Russian strikes that when Russians are targeting stuff inside Ukraine, they're targeting schools, hospitals, boarding homes, elderly homes. They're targeting defenseless civilians. But when Ukraine is targeting inside Russia, they are targeting high value assets that are turning the tide of this war. And on top of that, what these strikes show us is that Russia's air defenses and anti-drone systems are basically non-existent or useless. Either way, there's no point in having them if they're not going to stop all these strikes that Ukraine is carrying out and targeting and taking down your refineries and oil depots. Energy sector is one of the few hopes the Russian economy has during this time of the war economy or special military economy, and even that Putin cannot defend with his struggling weapons industry. Now let's get into some of the clips from these strikes so you guys can see how the aftermath looks. Then we'll talk about how Putin is basically having a meltdown because of everything that's going on. First, Ukrainians are just stepping up their attacks inside Russia, and now even Trump isn't providing the kind of relief that Putin was hoping for. But first, here are the strike videos. First, we have Russia's fourth most powerful oil refinery burning following a massive Ukrainian drone strike. Jason J. Smart says the path to freedom needs a torch to illuminate the way ahead. This is the way ahead. Watch the clip yourself, it's a very short one. Next up, we have more than 10 explosions at the Russia's Razan oil refinery. Freedom has come to Russia. Now, as I said earlier in the video, we had more than 20 attacks just in January. Of course, I'm not gonna bore you guys showing you 20 different clips, but here's one more. A plant in Bryansk, Russia was hit by Ukraine. Most of the plant production was used in Russian military industrial complex, so it's definitely a good news. Here's the clip. Now, of course, if you guys want to see all the clips, be sure to check us out on Twitter, and also go ahead and follow Jason J. Smart on Twitter. He has been keeping us up to date on Ukrainian news while staying in Kyiv. So definitely give him a follow, let him know Business Basics sent you. Now let's look at the other side. Ukrainians are targeting these high value assets. What is Russia doing? Well, Russia has this one big issue that they're not able to target military assets or important assets inside Ukraine because of the air defenses the Ukraine got from Western countries, from the USA. And because of that, what they're left doing is targeting civilian infrastructure, civilian buildings, hospitals, and all that. That's a war crime, and the whole reason Russia is doing all this is because they have realized they cannot win this war on the battlefield, so they want to inflict as much pain as they can on Ukrainian citizens, and then just hope that hopefully these citizens would put pressure on the Ukrainian government and Zelensky to end this war, to negotiate peace that's in favor of Russia. And this is all, it's not me saying it, Russians themselves are admitting to all this on Russian state TV. On Kremlin-controlled TV, they're saying it that Ukrainian defenses are just too hard to breach, and then we have footage of Russia launching missiles and drones on civilian infrastructure. So we can put two and two together. On one side, Russians themselves are saying that air defenses are too hard to break through, and most of the air defenses are located to protect the high-value targets in Ukraine. So Russia is looking for any win they can get, and they're attacking civilian infrastructure. Here's the clip from the Russian state TV saying this exact thing.
I want to start my brief talk by saying we shouldn't be fooled by various myths, illusions, or even great historical memories. If we advance at the pace of the Red Army's counter-offensive near Moscow, we wouldn't be talking about just a few meters or 1 square kilometer per day. After all, despite constant claims that Ukrainian defense is about to collapse, about to crumble, which they've been saying for many weeks, if not months, it's still not falling apart or crumbling. I'm just saying that while history inspires, it also makes us reflect on current events.
While all this is happening, what is Putin doing? The man who started this 3-day special military operation that has turned into a 3-year war that's destroying Russian economy? Well, Vladimir Putin is freaking out because Trump administration isn't exactly behaving like he had hoped. There's no relief coming from anyone from the Trump side. Now, in earlier videos, we have covered statements from Trump himself on how he will deal with Russia if it doesn't come to the negotiating table. But today, I want to show you guys some statements from the other members of the administration. Let's start with Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State under Trump. Here's his statement when it comes to this war.
The promise the president made, really, if you look at it, is it's going to be the priority. It's going to be the official policy of the United States that the war in Ukraine needs to come to an end. It is a stalemate. It's a war and it's a conflict that was started by Russia. But it is now a stalemate, a protracted and bloody conflict, been incredibly destructive. I would argue for both Russia and Ukraine, but Ukraine is paying the biggest price of all to its energy infrastructure, to the people and lives that have lost, to the millions of Ukrainians that have had to leave their countries and are living overseas. The conflict needs to end. And it's a policy of the United States that we want it to end. We want to do everything we can to help it end. We are going to engage in making it end and in a way that is sustainable, meaning we don't just want the conflict to end and then restart in 2, 3, or 4 years down the road. We want to bring stability. We have a lot of important and pressing issues around the world, and I think everyone should wake up this morning and be very happy that we have elected as our 47th president a man in Donald J. Trump that wants to promote peace in the world and bring it to the end of these conflicts.
Wording used here is very important. As he said, this was a conflict started by Russia, no one else but Russia. And that's exactly right. It's a senseless, unprovoked war that Putin started to rebuild his Soviet dream empire. So when the peace negotiations do come, everyone needs to keep that in mind. We cannot reward Russia for starting a war, attacking another sovereign nation, and get away with it with beneficial terms. Everyone has to make sure Russia doesn't come out ahead in these negotiations, because then we're just setting up incentives for other dictators, other authoritarian leaders to launch an attack and hope that the world gets tired of the war and just gives them what they want, just gives them an easy way out. This is where I want to show you guys a clip from the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent. During his confirmation hearing, he lays out the facts exactly how they are. He explains how the Biden administration didn't really go as harsh as they could with the sanctions because they did not want to raise the energy prices, the oil prices during an election season. He goes on to add that if he's confirmed, he plans to implement sanctions much harsher than what has been implemented so far, and he wants to make sure that Russia feels the pain of this war if they don't come to the negotiating table. And guess what? He was confirmed. So listen to this clip.
I believe that the sanctions regime, especially, well, first of all, I would say in my adult life that the tragedy going on in Ukraine is one of the greatest tragedies of my adult life, and ending that as soon as possible, and any role that Treasury can play in that, if confirmed, I would like to do. As we discussed, I believe that the sanctions were not fulsome enough. I believe that I believe that the previous administration was worried about raising U.S. energy prices during an election season, and I am perplexed to see that National Security Advisor Sullivan, on his way out the door, is raising the sanctions level on Russian oil companies. And indeed, the oil prices in the U.S. are up about 9% this month. So what was good for that administration is being foisted on us. But having gone from, I think, low-level sanctions to mid-level, that if any officials in the Russian Federation are watching this confirmation hearing, they should know that if I'm confirmed and if President Trump requests, and as part of his strategy to end the Ukraine war, that I will be 100% on board for taking sanctions up, especially on the Russian oil majors, to levels that would bring the Russian Federation to the table.
And I will only take 30 seconds. Let me just get 30 seconds. Thank you for that, because I think it's important that we don't take these tools out of the toolkit. We can litigate what the past administration did and when they did it, but increasing pressure on Putin to bring about a resolution, I very much appreciate your willingness, and I hope you will be an advocate for keeping those sanctions on and actually advancing them even further. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Warner.
Now, if you've been watching our videos for the last few days, then you know sanctions weren't just the problem. It's one thing to announce sanctions, but we also have to enforce them and police them, because if we don't enforce the laws, it's not a law, it's just a suggestion. And that's exactly what previous administrations started doing at the end of their administration, at the end of their term. But this time around, the special envoy to Ukraine-Russia war, Keith Kellogg, says that he plans on doing that from the first day. He plans to enforce all the sanctions. Currently, he rates the enforcement level at 3, and he wants to bring it up to 10. That's out of 10, by the way. So he basically wants to double down on enforcement on all the sanctions we have, and then we have the Secretary of Treasury saying that he wants to up the sanctions. So let's watch this clip real quick before we get into Putin's response.
General, we put up that map, and the map really hasn't changed as far as areas being controlled. There have been some counteroffensives by the Ukrainians in the blue area there, but the red has really been the same for a year plus for Russian control. If you look at the headlines, with Trump's return, Ukraine renews a push to seize Russia's frozen billions. North Korean troops no longer seen on the front lines fighting Ukraine. Germany's budget committee wants to appoint some 3 billion euros for Ukraine sources. A lot of people are wondering whether the Trump administration is going to continue to fund weapons in the short term for Ukraine, or continue to push Vladimir Putin and Russia with additional sanctions to try to put the pinch on them to get them to the table.
Yeah, and Brent, that's going to be up to the President of the United States, what he wants to do. That's his call, as the leader of our nation. But look, what we see out there and what's happened before with the previous administration, when they had a strategy of as long as it takes as much as it takes, that's really not a strategy, it's a bumper sticker. But when you look at this, let's use the sanctions as a great example, the recent sanctions. If you go on a gradient of 1 to 10, 10 being the toughest, 1 being the easiest, I think when it comes to the sanctions, we're probably only at a 6, but the enforcement's only about a 3. Like, for example, we have sanctioned the Ghost Fleet, not just by the fleet, but actually by the hulls, the ships themselves. And yet we've really not addressed that, because that's carrying almost 70% of the oil, the illicit oil that's going overseas from Russia. That's where they get their money. It's petrodollars. These are the kind of things we're looking at, talking about how do we apply pressures not only to the Russians and incentives as well, but also to the Ukrainians. We're going to give them incentives and pressure points as well, and give the President of the United States leverage to complete that. And that's what we're doing, and going through the process, talking about it, getting the team on board.
Since we have upped the enforcement on Russian sanctions, even Russian allies are starting to ditch Putin. As soon as the Biden administration announced that they were sanctioning these ships on the Shadow Fleet that was transporting Russian oil, what happened was we had 2 ships that were about to dock in China and India and unload the oil that they were selling to these countries at a discount. But the sanctions were announced, and both countries, China and India, said, hey, you cannot come to our ports because we cannot risk getting sanctioned by US. Because if these countries, these companies, the Indian, Chinese companies that are dealing with these ships that are on the sanctions list, they risk falling on the sanctions list, and that means they cannot do businesses with US banks, they cannot deal in US dollars, and that's a headache for any country, any company that's dealing internationally, and that's exactly what other people cannot risk. Even the countries that are so-called pro-Russia in a sense, that are still dealing with Russia, haven't slapped on sanctions on Russia, they don't want to risk pissing off the US administration and get landed on the sanctions list. This is the kind of enforcement that Putin is afraid of, because if countries like India, China, Iran start backing off of Russia, stop helping Russia, then the Russian economy is gonna be the relic of the past. As you guys can see from the chart on your screen, the inflation is already rising in Russia, and these are doctored numbers. Russia is not releasing real numbers to hide the true effect of the inflation, the true inflation number. We have had some independent studies done on Russian food supply, Russian goods supply, and we know the inflation could be as high as 23%. And that kind of makes sense if you look at the Russian interest rate. The official interest rate that the Central Bank of Russia sets is at 21%. That means the inflation is getting out of control. It's so out of control that even government cannot lie about that inflation is not rising. And that's why even with the doctored number, if you see the chart on your screen, you can see that the inflation is rising every single month. And just recently in December, roughly a month ago, Putin had this end of the year Q&A, and almost half the questions, maybe 30% of the question in this 4-hour Q&A were relating to inflation, and Putin was basically saying, hey, that's central bank's fault, that's not my fault. But in reality, the inflation is being caused by the Russian military spending. The Russian military is spending so much money that it's keeping the economy alive, it's keeping the economy growing. But at the end of the day, this is not long-term economic growth, because you're making a tank that's going into Ukraine and getting destroyed. You don't have anything to show for it except for the fact that you just wasted so much money. And on top of that, if we keep in mind that roughly 800,000 casualties that Russia has sustained in this war, more than 1 million people have fled Russia to avoid the draft or because they just don't agree with this war, we have had roughly 2 million people who are just being pulled out of the workforce. So all the people that these military companies are hiring, they're hiring from an already decreased workforce, so they have to pay them higher salaries and higher bonuses. That means the military is spending and printing a lot of money, but the second part of this, the secondary effect of this, is that military manufacturers, the defense contractors, are hiring all these people with big salaries and big bonuses. That means, let's say I'm some other kind of business. Let's say I'm a coffee shop or I'm a school who's trying to hire teachers. Now, these businesses have to compete with whatever the military is paying people. The military contractors are paying people. That means they have to raise their salaries, they have to raise their bonuses. That means the inflation is going up, not because the central bank is raising the interest rate, it's going up because the military spending, and the military spending is happening because of Putin, because he started a war that he cannot win. He started a 3-day special military operation that's still going, and we're approaching 3 years. All the while, he wants to blame someone else. He's just saying central bank needs to get inflation in control. He's saying central bank needs to cut interest rate, when in reality, it's like him causing the inflation that central bank is trying to fight with raising the interest rate. As you guys know from our own last few years after COVID, when we had high inflation, the central bank here, the Fed, had to raise interest rate to get inflation under control. Over there, they're trying to do the same thing, but Putin is not slowing down his spending, so central bank is basically fighting an uphill battle. All the while they're trying to bring inflation down, Putin is pushing the inflation up and blaming them. These are all the reasons exactly why we've been saying that 2025 might be the last year for this Russian war, because their economy cannot sustain it. And that's why we need to get this information out to as many people as possible who think that Ukraine is the one losing the war, when in reality, Russia has barely gained any ground and they have lost hundreds of thousands of people just this year. We are able to get this information out to more people because of you, so thank you so much for liking and hitting the subscribe button down below. And if you're able to, we would highly appreciate if you become a member on this channel to support our independent journalism. It takes as little as $5 per month, and it can help us out tremendously. So if you're interested, you can become a member by clicking the join button down below.